Hi everyone, welcome back to the GNI DataN webinar series 2 on data journalism and visualization for rookies. My name is Kwek Sir Kwang King, or you can call me King. I'm one of the two trainers for this series, and the other trainer is Trina Leong, and she will join us during the Q&A sessions today. Last week, in our first session of the data journalism webinar series, we talked about the introduction to data journalism, and we look at different, some of the best data storing stories coming from all over the world, right? So this week, today, we are talking about, the more practical questions, which is how do you discover or how do you find stories from data, right? So let's start. Again, just to let everyone know that this series is sponsored and funded by Google News Initiative. But the slides that we are sharing today, that we are presenting today, and the syllabus, are designed by Trina and I. And this series is also jointly organized by DataN, which is my own company based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. So we do data journalism consultancy and training for journalists and newsrooms. All right. To talk about finding stories from data, right? Right before you venture yourself or right before you dive into the data, you have to ask yourself, what are the stories that you are trying to find? What are the end results or the outcome that you're trying to produce, by looking at the data. So usually, right, there are two common approaches here. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list because there are many other ways, how do you handle data, right? But the common one is the first one is that you have a questions or you have a hypothesis and you want to answer the questions or you want to verify the hypothesis by looking at the data. To give you a very simple example, right? So for example, I would say that, in Malaysia, in the past 5 years, most of the car accidents were caused by driving under influence, DUI or, drink and drive, right? So that is your hypothesis, right? Your hypothesis is that, okay, most of the car accidents that happened in Malaysia for the past 5 years were caused by drink and drive. So can you prove or disprove the hypothesis with data? Of course, you get the car accident data for the past 5 years, and you try to check, what are the causes, of those accidents, and you are able to verify, or we call it, proof or disprove your hypothesis, right? So the first one is a very common approach, right? You have a hypothesis or you have a questions, and that the answers can be measured by using data, right? The second approach is that you have a data set and you think that the data set is worth exploring, okay? You don't have any questions or any hypothesis in mind. For example, the police has just disclosed or announced the crime index data for the past 1 year. Okay, so they share the data with everyone, right? So you don't have a questions yet about what you want to find, but you just go into the data sets and do some simple manipulation or do some deep dive analysis and try to see if the data set will show you certain patterns or insights, right? So we call that second approach as usually we call it as a fishing trip, right? Fishing trip is like you don't know what fish you want to catch. You just know that, maybe that lake or that area, has a lot of fish. You are assuming there's a lot of fish. So you go and do the fishing and hopefully you're able to fish, some good, you are able to get some good output from the data set, right? So in this case, usually I encourage if you are beginners, right, you should start with the hypothesis questions approach, because this approach is actually more efficient than the fishing approach, right? It gives a very clear direction. Okay, you have a hypothesis, you want to prove it or disprove it, or you have questions, you want to answer it using data, and you set out. You go and try to find the data, right? If you can't find the data, there's no data, the data doesn't exist, or you can't get the data that you want, then you know that, okay, this project is not going to happen, and then you move on, right? So it gives you a very clear direction, right? It helps you to plan your project, and you know your project scope, right? When you cannot find the data, or the data is not reliable, or maybe there are other problems, right? You know that, okay, I'm not going to be able to answer my questions or to prove my hypothesis, so I have to move on, right? So it's a very so you know your scope very clearly, right? And the other point is that it delivers a story, not just data, right? When we say that you want a story and not data, right? You are not doing something like, oh, this company A um, has called their AGM today and they have announced their performance. So you take some of the statistics from the performance and you do a business story. That is the data. You're just showing the data. There's no story, right? It's like company A earning how much at the first quarter of this year, and period. That's it, right? That is, you're just showing the data. You are not delivering a story, right? The hypothesis approach will help you to deliver a story. You are asking something that you want to get the answer by looking at the data, right? For example, the car accidents, right? Because maybe back to the car accidents questions. So maybe the debate is about, whether we should increase the penalty on drink and drive, right? Whether we should have a new law, to govern, this kind of offense. So to help with that debate, right, you look at the data, right? So you deliver a story, not just data, right? This is opposite to the second approach. Second approach, you might get you think it's a good data set, you do an analysis on data set. At the end, you're just presenting data. You didn't get any interesting story from the data sets. All right. But when we are saying that, okay, the first approach, forming a hypothesis or the questions is a better approach, right? We also need to learn how to formulate a strong hypothesis, right? I have some links in my slides here, and I'm going to share with you the slides at the end of my presentation today. So don't worry about taking notes, and don't worry about taking screenshots, because I'm going to share with you the whole slides by the end of today. Okay. So when you're forming a hypothesis, right, you can ask this four different, I call it question categories. Okay. The first one is I call it a problem questions, right? You are trying to quantify the problem. How big is the problem? How expensive is the problem, right? If you are saying road accidents, right? How much do road accidents cost to the country? Okay, in terms of damage, in terms of people affected, injured, or fatalities, right? So is the problem getting better or worse? You can measure that using data, right? You can compare 10 years ago and currently the current rate, and to compare whether there's a going up or going down, right? That is a problem questions. The second one is, we call it a impact questions. You know the questions, you measure the questions, you know the you quantify the questions, right? Now is that, who is affected by that problem? Okay, how are they affected, right? And when you say that people are affected, right, which group was affected more than others? Are they more vulnerable? Are they marginalized communities? So try to find out, who are these people, where do they live, how old are they, right? So this is the impact questions. Usually we are talking about impact to people. Sometimes if you are working on environmental issues, you might want to find out the impacts to the environment or to wildlife, right? So the second question is impact questions. The third one is cost questions. Are you able to find out the causes of the problem by looking at the data? Not by talking to experts and then you believe 100%, what the experts told you, right? You want to access the data that they have, or you get your own data and try to find out what are the causes of the problems, right? So, for example, back to the example of road accidents caused by drink and drive. What are the causes, right? Is it because there's no other transport options besides from driving, right? So you're trying to find out those causes by looking at the data, right? Because then you might want to look at the court documents, when these people, when they were charged in court due to drink and drive, what are some of the reasons, they gave to trying to justify their behavior, to trying to explain why they have to drive, right? These kind of problems. So you can quantify it, right? The cause questions. The fourth question is the solution questions. What is the solution of the problem? Can data tell you about the solution of the problem? And not just solution, but how effective the solution is, right? So by looking at the data, for example, if we are talking about increasing the penalty to deter people from drink and drive, does this work in other countries? So you might look at data of other countries before and after they increase the penalty on drink and drive, right? And what are the effect? Is it effective in those countries, right? So if you want to form a strong hypothesis, you can think from these four different questions categories, right? So I'm going to show you one example about how do you form a strong hypothesis. The first one, let's say you are going to a country, you are going to do the problem about malnutrition in a country, right? So you form a hypothesis. The hypothesis is that children in this country are dying of malnutrition. This is the hypothesis. But this is a very vague hypothesis, right? And very general, okay? So how do we improve it to become a strong hypothesis, a good one? So we can do one more step. We're trying to ask about the impact questions. Okay, who are those children? So then we can modify our hypothesis to be more specific into most of the children in this country who died before the age of 5. Okay, died of malnutrition. So now we have a more specific group that we are looking into, right? The children before the age of 5, right? And that is an impact questions, right? We can be more specific, a better hypothesis where we can modify it to become most of the children in this country who die before the age of 5 die of malnutrition, and they live in the poorest provinces. Okay, so this is both a impact question as well as a cause question. The cause is because of poverty, right? Because of poverty, there's a high rate of malnutrition in those communities, right? If we want to include the solution questions in our hypothesis, we can do that, right? So let's look at the last modification of the hypothesis, right? Most of the children in this country who die before the age of 5 die of malnutrition, and they live in the poorest provinces, despite a government food aid program that was supposed to cut malnutrition rates in half over 2 years. So now we add a solution problem to the hypothesis, right? So we identify who are the people affected by this issue, right? What are their characteristics, their age, where do they live? They live in the poorest provinces, which means this shows their socio-economic background. And then we know that there is a solution in place, but it looks like the solution doesn't solve the problems, right? So if we combine all these things together, then we have a very strong story, right? If we are able to prove or disprove the hypothesis here, right? But again, this is a hypothesis, which means that we need to find data, we need to find facts to support our hypothesis or to disprove our hypothesis. We might find facts that are totally contrary to this hypothesis, and that is also a story, right? But if you can add in more different question categories into your hypothesis and be more specific, then you will be able to get a strong hypothesis that will lead you to a strong data-driven story. Okay? Right. Once we have a hypothesis, then we go and find our data, right? Last week, I already covered how do you find data. I share with you a list of data sources. And in our first series, on digital tools, right? You can check all these videos on our YouTube channel, the Google News Initiative YouTube channel. We have all the videos in 3 different languages on the first series and the second series, right? Right now we are in the second series. The first series, we actually cover digital tools. One of them is how do you do better Google search to find information, to find data. And the second is if your data is in a PDF format, how do you convert that data from PDF into spreadsheets using a tool called tabular, right? So you can check out the previous video on digital tools on how do you use tabular, all right? So here now is that we already find the data and we have the data already. What do we do with the data, right? This is what I'm going to show you. If we are going into the first approach, right, that we have a hypothesis, then it's very easy. We go to the data, we straight away analyze the data to trying to answer our hypothesis. But what if you are at the second approach? You have a data sets, and let's say you have exclusive data set that is only available to you, or a data set that is you think you can find good stories, right? What do you do with the data sets? Basically, we are trying to identify four different findings from the data set. The first is you want to use that to verify your hypothesis, the first approach that I mentioned. The other three is that you use the data to find trends and contrasts, outliers, hidden connections. Those are the things that might give you good stories, right? That might help you to produce stories, or it might lead you to more clues to find good stories. Okay, so let's look at some example, right? Trends and contrasts, right? For example, this is a story that I did a few years ago, looking at the forest area in Indonesia. So the chart on your left, you'll see that using the data, I'm able to show a trend, right? The trend is that Indonesia forest, has been decreasing over the year from 1990 to 2015, but we can see that the speed of the decrease, right, has slowed down after the year 2000, right? So you are able to see the trend, by looking at the data. On your right hand side, right, the chart is about changes in forest area again during that 25 years period, but we're looking at different countries, right? So this is a contrast example, right? If you compare China with Indonesia, you see that China has increased their forest area in the past 25 years, right? And Indonesia has decreased, their forest area has dropped in the past 25 years, right? So there's a contrast, right? There's a very huge growth and there's a very huge loss of forest area, right? So this show you a contrast, and contrast is also a good story sometimes, all right? So you're able to look at, okay, if the story is about Indonesia and you want to talk about solution, then you might want to look at what have they done in China to be able to grow the forest in the past 25 years, right? So those are solutions, right? By looking at the data, you're able to identify some potential stories, and the data will give you some clues where to pursue the next part of your story. Okay. Outliers means data points that are very far away from the average, right? Way off from the average, right? For example, this is the students passing marks of reading and mathematics in different schools, right? Each circle represents one school, right? These are the statistics of schools in a county. County is like a district in the US, right? So you look at the right bottom corner, right? There are 5 schools, right? These 5 schools very far from others, right? So those are called outliers, right? They are very far and they have very low passing percentage in terms of reading and math, right? It's below 10%. And at the same time, they have a high percentage of black students in those schools, right? It's above 80%. So the whole story, this is actually a story done by Tampa Bay Times a few years ago to look at some of the black schools in one county and what happened to them, right? So they using the data there, and they're looking at outliers. They were able to find these 5 schools, right? And these 5 schools become the center of their whole reporting series, right? They focus on these 5 schools because these 5 schools, they have very high percentage of black students, and at the same time very low percentage of passing their reading and mathematics tests, right? So this is special, right? These 5 schools are special because they are very far from the average, right? So in this case, the data help us to find the outliers, and those outliers are good stories, right? Hidden connection. This is the chart produced if you look at the Panama Papers, right? It is. I don't have to explain what is Panama Papers. If for those who are not familiar, just go and Google it. Panama Papers is one of the greatest investigations, in recent history done by journalists all over the world. It's a huge international collaboration, right? And by looking at analyzing all the data that they have collected, right, and documents and things like that, they are able to find the connections, right, between different people and of course different corporations. How are they related to each other, right? So this is hidden inside the data, right? If you don't analyze the data, you won't be able to know that, oh, this guy is actually a shareholder of this company, and this company has another shareholder, right? And they share the same company, and this is how they are linked together, right? So these are hidden connections. Hidden connections in data sometimes helps you in terms of investigating conflict of interest, investigating a scandal or scam, things like that. All right. So, but once you get your data right, you need to prepare your data. A lot of time when we get the data from whether it is from a report or whether it is from some international data portals, right? The data is not in a ready format for us to do analysis, right? So sometimes you need to prepare your data, or I say clean your data, right? There are several rules that you should follow. The first one, the first row is your header, right? Only the first row. Don't have more than one row of header, right? Because a lot of most of the spreadsheets, right, they start treating the second row as data. So you can only keep your header in the first row. Okay. And the second one, no merge cell. I know that when we want to print out a nice table, we like to merge the cell, right? So that you have a huge cell, and then a huge cell under that you have like sub cells, right? So like the big one that you merge, and you have smaller cells, right? Don't do that. Don't do that in data analysis, right? Data analysis, all the cells should be separate in their own cell, and you only have one data in one cell, right? Don't merge any cells, okay? And each row is a separate data record. So keep one row and the second row. Don't keep like, let's say, oh, this is Malaysia GDP in this row, and you put Philippines GDP in this row, and then Singapore GDP in this row. So you only keep one data record, in one row. Okay. Try to avoid blank cells. If you see blank cells, put something so you know that it's blank cell. And what does that mean, right? Does it mean there is no data? Does it mean that it is not applicable? Or does it mean that it's zero, right? So blank cell can mean a lot of things. So you need to fill up blank cell with something that you understand what is it, right? Is it not applicable, or is it not available, or is it just zero? If it's zero, just then you put a number zero, right? So don't have any blank cells, right? Because later you might make mistakes because of those blank cells, right? And sometimes you need to clean your data, right? Especially if you are getting raw data. For example, you ask your readers to fill up a form, right, to give you some information. You collect all those forms, and usually those kind of raw data that has not been processed by anyone has a lot of typos, mistakes, and things like that. And you need to do some data cleaning, okay? Um, so when we are saying clean data, right? How do you clean your data? Usually we are talking about, there are some mistakes that we need to fix. There are different types of dirty data, dirty elements in those data that we need to fix. For example, misspellings or discrepancy of spellings. For example, center and center. One is TER, one is TRE, right? One is a UK spelling, one is a US spelling. They refer to the same thing, right? For example, you have a Center for Investigative Journalism, and then one data might spell it as TER, the other data might spell it as TRE, and both of them actually refer to the same institution, right? So you want to combine them, you want to fix them, standardize them, right? Okay, so that is them. And sometimes they like to use abbreviations, for a lot of things. For example, the bank, right? The bank's name, usually in Malaysia, you have, for example, Maybank, right? But Maybank, the full name is not Maybank. The full name is Malayan Banking something, right? So sometimes these person will type it as Maybank. The other person will say Malayan banking something. So you need to standardize them, right? So these are the discrepancies that you need to standardize. Names as well, right? Names, you have Muhammad Ali, for example. Some people spell Muhammad as Mohd, the short form of Muhammad. Some will spell it Muhammad, full spelling, But both Muhammad Ali refer to the same person. So you want to standardize it, right? What else? Bad data. Bad data are missing, meaning that, for example, age. Somebody put 150. You know that that's wrong, right? Because nobody can live until up to 150, right? You know that's wrong. You need to fix it. Missing data, right? Blank. Blank. That what does it mean? Does it mean there's no data? Does it mean it's zero, or that person forgot to put their data? You don't know, right? Duplicates, the same data has been entered twice or more than that. Okay. Sometimes you have leading and trailing spaces, meaning that, after the data, there are like another space at the end of the data point. So for example, I put my name King, Keng space, and Keng without space. The computer, the spreadsheet will see them as two different data points, right? Okay, so you need to fix those leading and trailing spaces. And here I want to introduce a very good tool that you can use to clean data. It is called Open Refine. Okay, you can just Google about it. There are many tutorials on Google Refine, and so far I find it to be the most powerful tool to clean data, and it is open source, which means that it is free. Okay. Right now I'm going to do a live demo about using some spreadsheets basic functions to demonstrate, how can you find stories or find insights from a data set, right? So if you, after this video, if you want to try yourself looking at the same data set, you can access the data set from this link that I put here, bit.ly/data GNI dash sample. Okay. My colleague will put this link in the YouTube channel so that you can access the data. All right. So let's jump into the data now. So we are looking at data of Chinese foreign direct investment into Southeast Asian countries. Okay, that is our main purpose. Okay, that's our main data set. Sorry. Why I use this because I think that most of you guys who attending today's video webinar are from Southeast Asia, right? So the Chinese investment is in Southeast Asia is always a controversial issues, right? But we can't really understand the issue if we don't look at the data, right? So here, what I'm trying to answer, right, my questions is that, which country in Southeast Asia is more dependent on Chinese investment, right? So I want to look at how much the FDI from China into each country in Southeast Asia. And not just looking at the absolute figure, but I want to know what is the how much the Chinese FDI, right, compared to all other FDI they receive, right, the percentage, okay? Because the higher the percentage, right, or the if your FDI, right, mainly coming from China, then which means that you are more dependent on China, right, compared to other countries, correct? So you don't look at the absolute investment, because if you look at the absolute number, for example, you compare Singapore to Cambodia, right? It's very different, right? Because Singapore has been attracting a lot of FDI, compared to Cambodia. So if you just compare their absolute number, it's not a fair comparison. But if you look at, how much of their total FDI is coming from a single country, then how much they are dependent on that country. All right. So that is exactly what we want to show. So I got the data from this ASEAN Statistical Yearbook 2019. Inside there are a lot of statistics there. I always like to look at the ASEAN Statistical Yearbook because they actually provide a lot of data about the countries in Southeast Asia. Sometimes those data are not available in your own country, right? Your own government don't announce or make those data public. So there's a part about foreign direct investment, and there is a series of table that shows you the direct FDI into each country, for example, into Cambodia, right? So I can get the China number from here, right? So it is the past 10 years, starting from 2009 to 2018. Data for 2019 has not been released yet, right? So you have like Indonesia, China investment into Indonesia. You also have China investment into Laos, into Malaysia, into Myanmar, and all those other countries, right? So what I did is actually, because this is the PDF file, right? So I used Tabula to convert this PDF file into spreadsheets. Okay, you cannot just copy and paste because that doesn't work. So if you want to know how to do that, refer back to the video for in the first series on digital tools. Okay, so what I get is this. Okay, so I convert the tabula. I convert the data from the PDF using Tabula into the spreadsheet here. So for example, this is Laos. Okay, so I put each country into different tab. Okay, right. So this is I'll just use this as an example. So you'll see that I want to know China. I want to know the percentage of China, right, out of the total investment received by that country in 2009, for example. So here I'm going to construct a new values here, right? Which is the percentage of China investment, right, out of the total investment received by Laos on the new percentage. And then I'm formula, right? So when I put a equal sign, right, right. So before that, let me just make it bigger so you can see it. Okay, so I put equal sign, then I'm going to calculate, right? So how do I calculate the Chinese investment? You know, the percentage of Chinese investment, right? So I will take the China correct and times 100 because I want to convert it into percentage, right? The from China is about 11% of the total FDI received by Laos in that year, correct? So you can double check again your the China value, and you'll see that the cell number B6 here, the color is the same, and the purple color B15 is here, right? You can use the same functions that I show here in Excel, all right? The reason I'm showing Google Sheets is just that so that we all, because when when we use Google Sheet, we all have the same interface. But if I use Excel, your Excel's version might be different from me, and then you might be a confusing like, oh, why your Excel is different? Why can't I find this button, right? But all this function in Google Spreadsheets can be used in Excel as well, all right? So after I've put in the formula here, I'm going to drag this box, right? Okay, so that the same formula is applied to all other cell. Okay, all other cell, which means that it is basically copy and paste the same formula, right? But when you do copy and paste, the Google Sheets will automatically change the cell for calculation from this row, from this column, sorry, into from this column into this column, right? So just now was 30, this number divide by this number, right? Now is this number divide by this number times 100, okay? So you get this, and then you get 2011 as well, right? 11 as well. You see that this number, this figure, divide by this figure and times 100, and you get this, right? And now you have some error, you know, value error. And why is it error, right? Because in this case, if you double click, you look at the formula, it is getting a NA divided by the total FDI, and you get a value because Google Sheets cannot use NA as a number to do the calculation, right? So that's why you get a value, right? And that means this year NA, I'm not sure what it means. You need to find out the definition of NA, not available. Is it not available or not applicable, right? Because this is obviously this is different from zero, right? Okay. Zero is zero, NA is NA. So if this is zero, then they will put zero here, right? They won't put NA, right? So NA must have some other meaning, right? So you need to find out, from why is it like this, right? And maybe you need to contact that government to try to find out, right? So from our problems here, because we cannot just simply put zero, right? Because this is not zero, right? If it's zero, then you have a zero here, okay? So this is not zero. So in this case, I'm going to change it to my own code. So I'm going to put a N A. Okay. All right. Right. So this one I might need to further investigate, or if I really use that in my story, then I'll have to explain. Right. Right. After I construct this calculation, right, I'm going to copy the data here. I'm going to copy the data here. Okay. And I will put into a new sheet here. Okay. When I paste, right, I have to be very careful. I have to paste special, paste values. So why? If I don't do that, if I just copy and paste, just click paste, I will get all this reference error, right? Because I am pasting the formula. Okay. You see the formula, right? But in this case, because I use the formula to get the values. So when I paste, I want to paste the values, not the formula, right? So I'm going to do that again. I'm going to click paste specials, paste values only. Now I get all the values, right? So the first row should be my header, right? My header should be the number of year, okay? Okay, I'm just going to copy and paste it here. Okay, so number of year, and this is Laos, right? Okay, so I do for all 9 countries in Southeast Asia, okay? And eventually I get this. This is the, including ASEAN. ASEAN, which means that the China investment into the whole ASEAN, right? The whole region, right? And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We have 9 countries, eight countries here, right? And again, just now, Laos, this one should be NA. I made a mistake before. This one should be NA, right? Because those are not zero, right? Okay. So now after we calculate for each country, right, I will do for, this is for Malaysia. Right, I'll do the calculation for Malaysia using the same, using the China figure, divide by the total figure and get one. So you see that here's Malaysia, Cambodia, Indonesia. So I do a calculation for all countries, and I copy and paste them into a new sheets here, and then I can see the comparison, right? So another trick that I like to use is that, because there are so many decimal points here, and those are not very meaningful, right? Usually for me to look at it easier, right, I usually will cut down the number of decimal points. So what I'm going to do is that I select all the data, and I'm going to do decrease decimal place. Okay, usually I will do 2 decimal points, right? And now I'm able to seek more clearer, right, of which country has higher number, which country has a smaller number, right? Okay, so now let's look at the latest number, right? The highest is this country, right? The China FDI in this country is about 80% of the total FDI. which is Laos, right? The second country, it's 25%, about one fourth of, is about one quarter of the FDI coming from China, which is Cambodia, right? Okay. So this case, right, I want to sort it. I want to look at the highest to lowest, right? Because I also want to know lowest, right? So instead of looking at, and trying to figure out which one is higher and lower, I can sort the table so that it starts from highest to lowest. And how do I do that? I have to select all the data, okay? And I go to under data and I click sort range. You select the range of the data, which means all the data that you want to sort, and you click sort range. First, you must click data has header row, because the first row is the header, right? It shows you which year, right? This is the first row, okay? You sort by the latest FDI, which is 2018, right? A to Z means smallest to biggest, Z to A means biggest to smallest. So I'm going to biggest to smallest, and I click sort. So now I will see 2018, right? It has been sorted from the biggest to the smallest, right? So the smallest is which country? It's Philippines, Malaysia, Myanmar. These are at the bottom. The country that rely heavily on China FDI is Laos, Cambodia, Indonesia, Vietnam, right? Okay, now what about the data before 2017 and 60? I want to know the trend. Okay, the trend meaning that are those countries, more reliant, more dependent on China or less dependent on China, right? For example, we want to know what are the patterns, right? So looking at the number here, right, unless you have some kind of superpowers, right, that is able to visualize the number here to know that which one go up and go down by looking at the numbers. Right? If not, then we have to do visualization. This visualization is not for us to publish the report. No. Visualization for publication is another issue that we'll touch next week on visualization. Today, the visualization we are talking about here is about visualize so that we can understand our data, right? So the visualization is for ourselves. It's not for our readers, right? The readers one is the visualization after some of our considerations, and we try to use that visual to help us to tell our stories. But here is that we use the visual to help us to find insights, find patterns, right, from the data here, right? Because without a visual, it's very hard to imagine which one go up and which one go down, right? Okay. So now we are going to do the same thing. We are going to select all the data. You can, if you're a keyboard person, you can use Control A on Windows or Command A on Mac, right? To select all the data. So once the data you select, once you have selected all the data, you click Insert, and you click Chart. And this is where you're going to see the chart. Okay, I'm going to zoom out a little. Aha, right. So you look at this chart, you will see that the highest is Laos, right? The Laos lines are broken because during there are 2 years where we don't have any data, right? We have the NA, right? Not available part, so there's no continuity here. But you see that Laos has been, from the trend has been like from very low in 2009. Now it reached almost 80%, right? Then the second country is, of course, this is Cambodia, right? Cambodia has been quite consistent, right, since the last 10 years, okay? We have also seen country that China FDI has fallen by a lot, which is this country, this is Myanmar. Myanmar, when it started in 2009, the peak was around 70%, I think, right? And then now it is, less than 10%, I think, right? So if you want to look at the numbers here, right, but not the highest countries, right, we can just remove those countries. Again, this is not for publication, yeah. So you don't have to adjust the colors to make it look nicer because you are not going to publish it. This is for our own exploration of the data. Okay. So what I'm going to do is that I am going to remove some of the countries. Okay, you go to setup and you try to remove. So I want to remove Laos because I want to look at those countries with lower percentage. I'm going to remove, this is Myanmar, right? Myanmar, remove Myanmar. Okay, and then this is Cambodia. Yep, Cambodia. So I'm going to remove Cambodia as well. To look at those countries with lower. Now you can see we are only looking at these countries, okay, without the highest one. Then you see that for ASEAN, right? ASEAN would be interesting because ASEAN, which means the whole region, right? So you see the whole region actually it is showing a uptrend, right? So it starts from around here, then going up a little, coming down here, but then going up again, right? So there's a slow, gradual increase for the whole ASEAN region in terms of Chinese FDI. And you also see that one country that has dropped a lot is this country, this is Malaysia. Malaysia in 2016-17, we reached the peak of China FDI and it dropped in 2018. I'm guessing the reason here is that we have a change of government in 2018, and the new government is not as friendly as the previous government towards China. That's why that might, affect the Chinese FDI in our country. I'm just guessing, right? I have to do more studies to prove that. But this gives us a good story, right? This will give you a good clue, right, to further your story. So why is the China FDI in Malaysia has dropped significantly in 2018? What are the stories, right? Or you want to do your stories about Laos or about Myanmar, right? Myanmar starting from a very high percentage, going down to a very low percentage, right? So this data, once you visualize it, you're able to see the trend, right? Just now before we make this chart, right? Just looking at the data here, we are not able to see all this kind of trend. We are not able to do the comparison, right, over the 10 years. But now we can look at the charts. So here is where we are able to investigate further. And this also give us some good story ideas, right? If you want to look at what happened to Myanmar, in the past 10 years, why it started as very high and then slowly it went down, So you might want to go back to Myanmar. If you want to focus on this story, then look at Myanmar and you see that, the investment from China, who has replaced China to become the main FDI, right? You look at 2018, right? The largest FDI is actually from Japan. No, sorry. Yeah, Japan. Yep, Japan. Right. Japan has increased, the percentage from 0.2, and now, as this is in $1 million, now it's 289 million, right? Okay, so able to angle is about Myanmar, then you might want to look at what happened to Myanmar, right? So this is an example of using data, doing some simple analysis, is able to guide us on what is our next story. And if you already have some hypothesis, for example, you want to know how dependent your country is on China FDI, right? And then you might, do this analysis to answer your hypothesis, whether it's more dependent or less dependent, right? So this is using data to measure the answers that you want to find. All right. So that's a quick demo. The other functions that I want to show you in Google Sheets or in any spreadsheets in Excel as well is called pivot table. Pivot table helps you to summarize your data, to answer your questions, right? So I'm not going to go into all the details. I'll just skip to the example, right? This is the second example of I want to show you pivot table. This is actually published by a US think tank, that track all the Chinese investment in different countries in all over the world, right? So they starting the tracking in 2005, and currently you see that they have have tracked about 1,600 plus investment by Chinese company in different countries, right? So you look at the data again, you will see that you can find the source of the data in this sheet called source, right? This is the website that I got the data from. So here you will see that the data will tell you which year, which month, which investor, the quantity of the investment, the share size, transaction priority, sector is interesting, whether it's metal, technology, or energy, or transport, right? Then there's a subsector, and the country. This is the country where they invested in, right? The region, and whether it is part of the BRI. BRI is the Belt Road Initiative, right? Or whether this is a greenfield FDI, right? You can go and find a definition about greenfield FDI. I'm not going to explain here. So what happens is that what if I want to find all the investment in Malaysia? How do I do that, right? So of course I need to do a filter to show Malaysia and get all the investment in Malaysia. So what if I want to have a list of all the ASEAN countries? So I have to do this again and again and again. So for example, I click on this and I do data and I do create a filter. Okay, click on the filter icon. Filter by, sorry, clear everything. And I put in Malaysia. Okay, and I click OK. So now I find all the Malaysia investment, right? So then if I want to just look at Malaysia investment, then I will have to copy the data here, put into a new sheet, and then I'll do the calculation, right? To look at how many millions, how many of the investments are in the sectors of metals, real estate, transport, things like that, right? And if I want to look at a second country, I have to do the filter again. I have to repeat all the steps again, right? But pivot table, the function helps us to summarize the data, doing exactly these steps in a much faster and efficient way, right? So I'm going to show you how do I do that. So I'm going to remove the filter. I just press undo to go back. Now I'm going to select all the data. So again, Control A if you are on Windows, or Command A, right, if you're on Mac. Select all the data. So now I selected all the 1,600 plus investment. I click data and I click pivot table. Okay, pivot table. Then you just click create new sheets. Usually it is usually better to put the pivot table in the new sheets so it doesn't mess with your original data. Okay. So this is a pivot table. And how do you construct a pivot table? For example, I want to know the investment in each country, right? So which means that there's a row here, there's a column here, there's a values here, right? There are three components here, right? Under the rows here, I want to have a list of countries. And I want to know how much the values of the investment, the total investment in each country since 2005, right? So under rows, I'm going to add country. And what happened when you add country, you will see that, there's a list of countries here, right? Okay. So now under values, right, I'm going to put the quantity in millions, right? If I put this, what would I get? I'm going to get the sum of quantity in millions, which means from the original data here, pivot table will find, for example, all the Canada investment, okay, and add up the quantity in millions for that country for Canada and show it here, okay. So this is Canada. The total is 56. This is 56 million, and this billions, right? Billions, 56 billions, right? So it adds up all, right? So what if I want to look at the investment in each year, right? In each year, like for 2005, 2006, 7, right? This is when I have to add a column, right? Remember just now I add rows here, values. I add country in rows. I add values. I add quantity in millions. Sorry, in values. So column I'm going to add year. And now you will see in each year, right, how much Chinese companies have invested in each country. Okay, and this figure, right, for example, if 1 year there are more than one investment, this is the total of all the investment in that year. So pivot table in this case is able to summarize your data for you, right? So just now, if you still remember, our objective is to find the investment, China investment in each country, right? In Southeast Asia. So I'm going to add the last one is a filters. Filters is, which means that I want to filter, I don't want to show all the countries. So I want to filter the country. And now I'm going to just put in, for example, I want to look at Indonesia, okay, Malaysia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar, what else? Thailand, Laos, Philippines, Singapore. Okay. I'm not sure if I included all the companies, all the countries. So hopefully 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, we have 9 countries here. And you look at now, you have each country with the investment in each year, right? So this is where we can then copy the data here. I just copy the data that I want, okay? I don't copy the total, right? I just click copy, Control C, copy, and I'm going to put in a new sheets, but remember, I will paste special, paste values, okay? And now I can then do a chart, right? To show the investment in each year, okay? Yep, okay. All the blank space, you need to fix that first before you create a chart, right? All the blank space, you need to put in 0. Okay, I don't have time to do that now, but you look at this, and then you will see that of course, this is different from the FDI because this one is based on each investment announced in the media. Okay, and FDI has a definition only for FDI, but not all foreign investment are considered as FDI, right? So there are different types of investment, right? But this one will tell you again, and we give you another picture about those China's investment, right? So of course you need to understand your data, and you need to read, where do they get the data, and what kind of data they include and they exclude, right? For example, FDI, you need to know what is the definition of FDI, what can be considered as FDI, and is every country calculate the FDI in the same way, right? So you need to understand that as well before you make the comparison, okay? But here I'm not trying to explain what is FDI, what is Chinese investment. I'm just using that as an example to demonstrate some of the functions in spreadsheets and how do you find stories in spreadsheets, right? So this is the first step I can do. And again, I can do another step, which is to look at different sectors, right, in those countries. So how do I do that? It's actually under the role, right? Under role, I can actually add another variable. So now we have country, right? I can add in sector. Now you'll see Cambodia broken down into different sectors, okay? Right, interesting, right? So let's say I don't want to look at all the different years. I just want to look at total, right? From 2005 to 2018. I want to look at the totals. So under column, I just remove the year. So now I'm looking at the total numbers, okay, of each country for all the data, which means from 2005 to 2018, right? And one thing actually that I observe, right, by just looking at it, I don't have to visualize it. I just look at I know that energy is actually a sector that Chinese investment has been very, very focused in, right? Energy is the highest for Indonesia, is the highest for Laos, highest, it's not high, so highest for Malaysia, right? So let me see. I can add another filters as sector. Okay, and then I just put in I just want energy. So now I'm looking at each country, the energy investment, right? Sorry, Chinese investment in the energy sector, right? So maybe here you can also do another. Um, uh, you can have look at another story here, right? Uh, the only country that energy is not the highest investment sector from Chinese firms is actually Singapore. Singapore is not the highest. If I look at the data again, Singapore. In terms of Singapore, the highest is actually logistics, right? Energy is like the second, right? Okay, energy is the second. Okay, and another thing is that if you want to look at like what are the investment in logistics, right? You can just double click this number here, and it will open up a new sheets to show you all the different investment in Singapore in the sector of logistic. You see, now everything is about logistics. All right. So this is pivot table, right? This is what I want to show you, right? Pivot table. Okay. We're going to go back to my PowerPoint. Pivot table, very useful. And you can just try to play with pivot table. The more you use pivot table, the faster. At first, it is not that intuitive. This tool, this function, so you need to spend more time to use it. Once you are very familiar with it, it's actually very powerful and it can help you save a lot of time. All right, it's one of the best functions that I like about spreadsheets. Pivot table is available in Google Sheets. Is also available in Excel. Just that maybe the interface is a bit different. Okay. And just now I show you, right, the visualization exploration tool, which means that sometimes after we prepare our data, we use pivot table to summarize our data. We still need to visualize our data to find interesting insights, right? So this is like what I do is this is like a cycle that I always do on my data, right? I visualize it and I look at the visualization and try to analyze, interpret, right? For example, just now the first visualization, we saw that the Chinese FDI in Myanmar, the percentage actually was way higher, right, in 2009, and then it drops, right? So then I interpret that here, and I can document it. So I jot down that observation, and I can transform my data set again, right? And then I visualize again. For example, if I just want to look at 2018, I just select the 2018 data and I visualize again, right? And maybe I can find some new interpretation, new analysis from the visualization. I document again, I jot it down, right? And then I keep doing this cycle, okay? Because the same data sets can be viewed from different angles, different perspective, right? Using different part of the data. For example, the second data set I show you, you can look at by country. You can also look at by sector, right? Which subsector, right? Okay. So if you keep doing this, then you'll be able to find more insights from the data set, which might be your story or which might help you to answer your hypothesis or which might lead you to find other stories. All right. Okay. This is again another example. This is the COVID-19 cases. So if you don't do the visualizations, it is very hard to compare Canada with Malaysia, right? If you can plot the chart, then you will know that how high or how low country to country. By looking at the data, right, you are not able to do the comparison unless you got some kind of superpowers, that you can imagine the data in your brain and trying to do the comparison. If not, plotting out on the chart is always a good way to do analysis. All right. If for those who want to learn more about spreadsheets tutorial, I recommend here 3 tutorials for spreadsheets, right? Yeah, the link is here, and will share with you the today's slides. You can download the slides from this bit.ly link, right? bit.ly data GNI2 EN, basically means English. And just this, as usual, right? I have a feedback form for you. Please scan this QR code to access the feedback form. We really appreciate your feedback. Let us know what we have done good or bad, and what are other topics you hope that we can try to cover in the future. We are still not sure after this series 2, should we roll out a series 3, and what topic, what themes should we cover if there is a series 3. All right. Thank you very much. Now it's time to look at questions, and also it's now time to bring out my partner, Trina, to the to our webinar.
Yes. Hi. So the first question that we have is if an information has multiple results, example race, Malay, Chinese, Indian, how do we put them in one row? Perhaps should we? I know that you showed a demonstration earlier, Kane, but I'm not sure if you want to repeat that, or is that already clear?
Trying to figure out.
King, are you there?
Okay, you don't put them in one row. You put them in different row, and you use pivot table to summarize them. That is what I would suggest, right? Don't put them in one row, right? So like this row 1, for example, you are looking about let's say household income for a Chinese family. You put in one row, Malay income in one row, and Indian income in another row. If you have let's say Chinese income in different states, right? From example, the state of Johor. This is Chinese, and the second is Chinese Malacca, and maybe the third one is Chinese Selangor, right? So each data record will take up only one row, and then after that you can use pivot table to summarize it. If you want to add up all the data, or you want to have a look average data, for example.
Okay, so the second question is: is there any legality in using any of the tools used to gather different data sets? We're worried about being sued if a story I want to find ends up being true through data support.
For the tools, right? For example, the spreadsheets and Excel, right? There's no legality issue. Google Sheets is always free. Excel, you need license, of course, it's under Windows Office. But if you don't have a license to Excel, there are other alternative free tools, for example, OpenOffice and LibreOffice, right? But I always find it Google Sheet is quite good because everything is online. You don't have to be, you don't have to you will not lose your data, right? Because you forgot to save and things like that. And the other advantage is, of course, you can collaborate with your colleagues, right? Multiple users can be on the same Google Sheets to work on the same data. And all your manipulations, the steps that you have done to your data, they are automatically recorded in the Google Sheets. So you are able to look at the history. If you have multiple users in Google Sheets, right, the history will also show who made what changes, so it is easier to track back, and also of course it's easy to resume back to an earlier version. If you have made some mistakes in your data, you want to go back to a earlier stage of the data, you can always go back using Google Sheets. I don't think you have that functions in OpenOffice or LibreOffice. Excel, I'm not sure. I think the latest version of Excel is also quite powerful. All right.
And the last question is between Excel sheet and spreadsheet, which one is good for journalists to try while they have never learned it before?
It depends on you. I think both are good, and then both are actually very similar to each other. Yeah, and both have very good tutorials online. Excel, of course, Excel is that you need to have the license, to have the software on your computer. And Excel has becoming more and more powerful in the past few years. They already have like the connection capability to connect to the internet, and they're able to process different things, right? But the interface between the two actually are very similar to each other. All the functions that are available in Excel are available in Google Sheets as well. Google Sheets might have some special functions, that are not available in Excel, but usually we don't have to use that, right? And the other thing is that, of course, you need to consider your internet connection, right? Because if it's Google Sheets, then it has to be online, right? Of course, you can do offline, but the offline, eventually you still have to connect to internet to update your document. For Excel, you can do everything offline, but sharing is a headache, right? You have to send the file to your colleagues, and then your colleagues have to save it and send back to you, right? So it depends on you. I don't have any preference, right? The reason I'm showing Google Sheets on my training is because that so that everyone can look at the same interface. Because if I use Excel, then people might have different versions of Excel, right?
I think that's about it for the questions right now. Unless anyone has any last minute pressing questions, because I think we've exceeded by about 10 minutes. Anyone else have any questions? If not, we'll just end the session here. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay.
All right. If
Yeah.
there's no questions, then see you next week. All right. Tomorrow we'll have the same sessions in the tomorrow is in Chinese. Then on
So tomorrow is Malay.
sorry, tomorrow is Malay.
It's tomorrow Malay.
And
The day after
Thursday
on
is
Thursday will
Chinese.
be in Chinese. Yes.
Yeah. And next week we're going to talk about visualizations using data, right? The same thing. Tuesday we'll have in English, Wednesday in Malay, and Thursday in Chinese. All right. So if there's no questions, then thank you very much, and see you next week. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.